Now that you've finished reading the Epic of Gilgamesh, I'd like to spend a little time and look at the ending, because I know for a lot of you, the ending is a bit anticlimactic, right? You go on this massive journey with Gilgamesh and spend all this time with him. You begin when he's a tyrant and a terrible king, and then we're introduced to Enkidu, who civilizes him to some degree, and then they have grand adventures. They kill Humbaba, and then Enkidu himself dies, and we see Gilgamesh's terrible grief then, right? And nobody does grief like the ancients. Gilgamesh is tearing out his hair and gnashing his teeth and biting things, rending his clothes. We just don't see enough of that anymore. But in all seriousness, it's this massive grief, because Gilgamesh for the first time is really confronted with the fact that his own mortality, the fact that he will die someday too. And so at that point he goes on his own search, through a Wildman period, in his own search for immortality. How might he achieve it? Eventually meeting up with Utanapishtim and trying to seek out that immortal life. And he doesn't get it, right? Well, first there's a consolation prize. Here, have this little bit of coral, and that'll make you young again. But he even loses that, and so eventually he just arrives back at the city of Uruk, having failed. And so we're left to ponder in this very quick, short ending, what's changed? Change is at the heart of all good stories. So what's different here? What's been achieved? Yeah, Gilgamesh is probably going to be a better king, but we don't even know that for sure. There's indications that he's changed and he's matured as an individual, but we don't see that. Instead, we're left with this sort of empty feeling at first, and that bothers a lot of modern readers. But we need to feel better about that empty feeling. It helps to look at this as an elegiac piece. An elegy is basically a poem or work of literature that's mourning something that's past or dead. And like a lot of the ancient epics, or the high-end poetry, here we have the Epic of Gilgamesh, or the Iliad, the Odyssey, as well as Beowulf, which we're going to read in this class. It is an elegiac piece, and it is looking back on something that's past. In this case, it's kind of the age of heroes. The ancient Greeks, when Homer or whoever wrote those poems, the poems of the Iliad and the Odyssey, they're several hundred years removed from whatever historical figures actually lived that inspired those tales. Same thing with the Epic of Gilgamesh. If Gilgamesh was a real king, and there's a lot of debate on that, the first instances we have of this poem are several hundred years after. Why is that? What's the case? Well, the common thread that seems to be going on with these is you have a wild period, a period of a culture's history or people's history where things are dangerous, there's often expansion, there's a frontier, a wild area, there's battles going on, and then those slowly fade away and the people settle down. In our own history as Americans, we have this period, right? The period of the Old West. And that's when we had these larger-than-life individuals, Paul Bunyan, Johnny Appleseed, cowboys and Indians, right? The guy with the white hat who has to go in and establish justice and fight the bad guys. Well, we don't have that anymore now, right? We're a staid and steady civilization. And so there seems to be this common thread of people looking backward at a time that's past that we can no longer inhabit. An age of heroes, and that's what's going on in Gilgamesh here. Now, obviously, from our point of view, Gilgamesh is quite the hero. He can do amazing things, but really, Gilgamesh in the story can't achieve the immortality that some of the ancients have, and so he's forced to confront the notion that one can no longer pass over the waters of the dead. The age of heroes is past, and the poem kind of mourns that a little bit. But there is a consolation prize for Gilgamesh as well. What's he left with? He can't live forever. The age of heroes is gone. You can't pass over the waters of death. But there is something. And we get an indication of that at the very end of the poem. Strangely, they arrive back, and Gilgamesh tells Ur-Shanabi, the ferryman, he's like, go up and walk on the walls. And this doesn't seem to mean much to the reader at the time, but it's a key to what's actually taken place. And in fact, as is so often the case in Gilgamesh, we get a bit of repetition here. But in this case, it's not repetition in that general vicinity, but rather repetition that calls us back to the very beginning of the poem. So let's look at the end, and then we'll look at the back, or let's look at the end, and then we'll look back at the front, and figure out what's going on here. So the ending, at the ending, Ur-Shanabi and Gilgamesh are on their way back to Uruk. At 20 leagues they broke bread, at 30 leagues they stopped for the night. When they arrived in Uruk, the sheepfold, said Gilgamesh to him, to Ur-Shanabi the boatman, O Ur-Shanabi, climb Uruk's walls and walk back and forth. Survey its foundations, examine the brickwork. Were its bricks not fired in an oven? Did the 7 sages not lay its foundations? A square mile is city, a square mile date grove, a square mile is clay pit, half a square mile the temple of Ishtar, 3 square miles and a half is Uruk's expanse. Well, what's that mean? He's saying, go look at my city. But if we go back to the very beginning of the poem and examine that, something starts to come to light. So looking way back on page 1, and the narrator here is talking about Gilgamesh. He saw what was secret, discovered what was hidden. He brought back a tale of before the deluge. He came a far road, was weary, found peace, and set all his labors on a tablet of stone. He built the rampart of Uruk the sheepfold, of holy Eanna the sacred storehouse. See its walls like a strand of wool, view its parapet that none could copy. Take the stairway of a bygone era, draw near to Eanna, seat of Ishtar the goddess, that no later king could ever copy. Climb Uruk's walls and walk back and forth. Survey its foundations, examine the brickwork. Were its bricks not fired in an oven? Did the 7 sages not lay its foundations? A square mile is city, a square mile date grove, a square mile is clay pit, half a square mile the rampart of Ishtar, 3 square miles and a half is Uruk's expanse. So what we have here is what scholars refer to as a ring structure. When you get back to when you finally get to the end, it immediately draws you back to the beginning. And what that's doing here specifically is reminding us that it was the 7 sages laid the foundations of those walls, but it was Gilgamesh that built the ramparts. It was Gilgamesh that made the city great. And in that we have a sort of immortality. And that's what Gilgamesh was after, right? He was sad initially because he couldn't achieve that, but he found a different way of obtaining immortality, and that's through his works. So why does he ask Ur-Shanabi to climb the walls? Because in so doing, he's asking Ur-Shanabi to participate in what he does have, what is his legacy. And the poem does the exact same thing for us at the very beginning. It tells the reader, climb these walls, examine Uruk, look at Gilgamesh's great deeds. And we do so by reading the poem. And in that reading, we participate in his achievement of immortality. We're giving Gilgamesh continued immortality every time we pick up this poem and read that. And so we're participants in this, and it's neat to think about. And it's a reminder for all of us that we can't live forever. Our days on this planet will end someday. We can't cross the waters of death. But nevertheless, through our deeds and our legacies here on Earth, we can achieve a sort of immortality. And in that sense, the book ends on a positive note. Gilgamesh has gotten what he's after. We participate in that, and we can also replicate it in a sense. And in a real way, that's pretty cool.